I'm sure everyone here, at some point in their lives, has donated either individually or through a charity to a water exploration program somewhere in the world, perhaps in Darfur for the refugee crisis, perhaps in East Africa for drought relief. But whoever asks how many water wells actually get drilled, what percentage of those wells find water? Is the water fresh or salty? Or like this well, is the water clear, tasteless, but toxic? This well tested for more than 300 parts per billion of naturally occurring arsenic. It was drilled by an NGO, a non-governmental organization, in the aftermath of the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. I was working in Aceh at the time for UNICEF, charged with assessing the impact of the tsunami to water resources and beginning the redevelopment of those water resources and water supplies to Aceh province in Indonesia. After the tsunami, many NGOs came into Aceh, to all the tsunami-struck areas, and they drilled many water wells based essentially on one criteria: where was their need? And this is, of course, is an important criteria, but more importantly is where is their water? Without information, without maps, without proper siting of water wells, one is essentially guessing. And what I hope to show you today, by taking you to 3 very different countries, to Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula, to Malawi in Southeast Africa, and then back to Aceh in Indonesia, what I hope to show you today is that the science of exploration geophysics is a necessary ingredient to properly siting water wells. And by properly siting, I mean putting the water wells in the best location to produce the most amount of water, of good quality water, at the least cost. Now, many of my colleagues would define geophysics as the art of carrying very complex and heavy equipment to the far corners of the world and then dragging that equipment through swamps and deserts and jungles. But it's what you do with the equipment that is what defines the science. And that is you create images, maps of the subsurface based on physical properties. So for instance, a seismic survey, you map the subsurface based on the velocity of sound. A gravity survey, you map the subsurface based on the density. And these geophysical maps, these physical property maps, you turn into geological maps. And those geological maps, you create maps of where there is water. And this is very analogous to how a radiologist would function in a surgical team. Would you go for major or minor surgery without an X-ray or an MRI or an ultrasound? Of course you wouldn't. Well, would you drill a water well without any subsurface information? Well, that, in fact, is normally what's done. One of the first regional water exploration programs I worked on was in the Hadramaut province in Yemen. This is the largest province in a country that truly is expected to run out of water in the next few years. In the initial part, the initial reconnaissance phase of any water exploration program, you go from village to the cities, to farmers, and you find out what the available resources are, what are people presently using. And one of the most influential interviews I ever had was this farmer you see in the picture, Abdul Rahman, and he showed me his hand-dug well, dug down to about 20 meters depth, and he showed me the pump he'd purchased that came from India. He told me how much water he got out. He showed me his date palm grove. And when I asked him about the water quality, he gave me an answer far more instructive than any chemical analysis. He said, "Shariba, drink it." So I did, and I immediately spit it on the ground. The water was about 20% of the salinity of seawater. And this taste, so to speak, stuck with my mouth when I got back to Calgary. I'm both a geophysicist and a hydrogeologist, and the memory of that water really galvanized my thought process to think there must be some way of synthesizing these sciences together to more confidently begin a water well drilling program. We hadn't actually drilled any water wells. So I went downtown to an oil and gas company that was working in that area, and they graciously laid out hundreds of kilometers of seismic data that they'd collected specifically for oil exploration, minus, of course, the deeper oil zones. And what was clearly evident to me were a number of strong reflectors, the black squiggly lines highlighted on the plot, that were clearly indicative of sandstone and limestone units, and quite possibly aquifers. So taking these seismic sections, we put them together into maps, geophysical maps, and then geological maps, and then turn those into groundwater potential maps. And we have here an example of one of an interpreted section, an artist's rendition of a section. And you can see, if you drill that well in the center of the section, you miss all the aquifers. You have no chance of hitting water. If you drill to the right, there's water down there, but the aquifer may be too thin to produce, too deep to drill, or too deep to pump economically. But if you drill where the rig is, you drill through the thickest part of the aquifer. An aquifer is a water-producing zone, any water-producing unit. You drill through the thickest part of the aquifer at the shallowest zone. So with this strategy, using maps and sections like this, over the next year and a half, we went on to drill 15 water wells. Each water well tested from a few hundred gallons a minute to over 1,000 gallons a minute. This is what 1,000 gallons a minute of water looks like. It's enough water for a small city. Now, this is a nice case study, a great feel-good picture, but in fact, it has much broader significance because these particular sandstone and limestone units are extensive over much of the Arabian Peninsula. We have hundreds of thousands of kilometers of seismic data over the Arabian Peninsula, and everywhere in the Arabian Peninsula is there a need for water. So let's go to another continent and another country, Malawi in Southeast Africa. Water, of course, is a key component to poverty reduction. You can build schools, but if women are walking many kilometers, spending all their days to get water, they have no time to go to school. You can build health clinics, but if, like in Malawi, more than 10% of children die before the age of 5 from diarrhea-related diseases, the health clinics are essentially just window dressing. But we don't have seismic data over most of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. Much of sub-Saharan Africa is underlain by what we call crystalline basement, which you can essentially think of as granite. That's solid, massive rock. It's terrible source rock for oil and gas, and it's not very good rock for water either. Most of your water zones are in shallow fractures that just produce a few gallons a minute. As such, sub-Saharan Africa is riddled by hundreds of thousands of shallow water wells, less than 50 meters deep, producing a few gallons a minute of water. The 35% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa have access to this much potable water a day. The average North American uses 20 times more water than that. The other 65% have access to even less water. There's 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in the initial phases of strategizing a water exploration program in Malawi, along with, the reconnaissance phase, and as part of that reconnaissance phase, I grabbed all available water well records. And I went through those records, and what I found was that about 1 of every 2 wells drilled found water. And of those, about 1 of every 2 actually produced water. Many, they found water initially, but the wells went dry within a week, a month, a year. So essentially a success rate of 1 in 4. And I tell you, this is better than many countries there. So what we had to do was come up with an exploration strategy that would improve on that. And we had to come up with our own custom-made strategy, since we had no available data. Nothing had ever been done like this in Malawi, and indeed sub-Saharan Africa. So the first thing we did was carry out a borehole geophysical logging program. So we took a selection of 20 boreholes, 20 wells, some dry, some producing a little bit of, some producing a lot of water. And then we carried out this logging program. And this brings us back to the very definition of geophysics, which is trying to find some physical property, the radioactivity of the rock, the magnetic potential of the rock, whatever, some physical property that will distinguish what we're looking for, which in this case is a good producing aquifer, from everything else. This is what you do in exploration geophysics. So we ran different tools down that measured the velocity of the rock, the density of the rock, and so forth. And what we found was that the best producing aquifers had an electrical conductivity that fell in a narrow but very measurable range. So using this information, we then went on to do a surface conductivity mapping program at 104 villages that serviced 70,000 people. And we see here an example of one of the data sets at the bottom and an artist's rendition of the interpretation of that particular data set. And what you can see is that if you drill on the right, there's no water. If you drill in the middle of this section, all in immediate proximity of the same village, there's a little bit of water, but your well might go dry in a day, a week, a month. But if you drill to the left of that rock barrier that's essentially acting as an underground dam, you drill through 20, 30 meters of water that will act as a sustainable water supply into the indefinite future, essentially forever, from the volumes of water you'll get out of a village hand pump. And you can see that that vertical dam is clearly imaged, at least clearly for geophysicists, by that red vertical feature in the geophysics section. So with these 104 villages, we sited and drilled 207 wells with a 94% success rate. What does that mean? That means we drilled those 207 wells, and 194 of them produced this much water per minute, not per day, per minute, within a 300 meters walking distance from a village. Again, this is great news, nice picture, but much broader regional significance. Because these conductivity mapping tools, not only can you run them in boreholes and do them from surface, but you can fly them from airplanes and helicopters. So you could carry out a conductivity mapping program and turn that into an aquifer mapping program over all of Malawi and all of sub-Saharan Africa, creating water resource maps that can be used for methodical, step-by-step development by non-governmental organizations, aid agencies, and governments. And come time for a water crisis, a drought, instead of flying airplanes with grain and rice from North America to Africa, which is what we do, you drill water wells. So why don't we do this? There's many complex reasons, governmental, political, social, but fundamentally it's optics. Aid agencies want that gratification of producing something people need, water. They see maps as research. But also, we the donors are at fault. You can take, next week is Halloween. Everyone knows kids used to come to your door with UNICEF boxes. If a child came asking for a donation for a water well for a school in Malawi, of course you would give them a donation. If they came to your door asking for a donation for a geophysical survey in Mozambique, you might think twice. So we've been to Yemen, where we've used geophysics to find an aquifer and map an aquifer where there was no water. We've increased the water success rate in Africa, in Malawi, from 1 in 4 to 9 out of 10. But what about a place where we have lots of water, Sumatra? Tropical country, it rains every month of the year, no dry season. Every house has 3 wells, one in the kitchen, one in the bathroom, one outside. And then in an instant, not only are the wells destroyed, but the aquifer is destroyed. The tsunami wave was 30 meters high. That pressure of that wave forced the salt water into the aquifer, what we call saltwater intrusion. At the same time, it overtopped the landscape, seeping into the aquifer, as well as entering through these large diameter wells. The population of Apche, about 4 million people, were supplied by these wells. Over 250,000 of these wells were knocked out. The response of aid agencies all over the Indian Ocean. This photograph, for instance, is from a colleague in Sri Lanka, was to come in with teams pumping these wells, taking the salt water, disposing it on the landscape, where it would go through the salt-contaminated soil into the salt-contaminated aquifer, and then be sucked back into the salt-contaminated well. If this seems like an absurd waste of money, it's because it is. Meanwhile, within a year of the tsunami, the German Geological Survey carried out airborne conductivity mapping program identical to what I described that could be mapped in Africa, and they carry out this program in all the flood-affected areas in Aceh, creating conductivity maps, which are essentially maps of salinity at different depths. So for instance, this map is at a depth of 30 meters in the vicinity of Banda Aceh, the largest city. The red zones are high salinity, the blue zones are low salinity. What do you do with this? Drill blue, avoid red. And you certainly don't even waste your time trying to remediate to restore wells in the red zones. So I hope I've showed you that there's a better way of drilling water wells and siting water wells than guessing. With geophysics, we can site those wells where we can produce the most amount of water and the best quality water, avoiding salt-contaminated zones, avoiding zones like in the first photograph that was arsenic contaminated. If the UN is going to meet its own millennial development goals of improving access to water in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's improving access, not solving the problem, but just improving, they're going to have to drill, they, as in we, as in aid agencies, as in governments, more than 60,000 wells a year for the next number of years. That's how many water wells need to be installed. Are we going to drill 65,000 wells to reach that goal, or are we going to drill 240,000 wells to reach that goal? 99% of geophysicists in the world are involved in oil and gas exploration and metals and minerals exploration. Less than 1% are directly involved in water exploration. Perhaps we should be availing ourselves more of this exploration science, exploration geophysics, to explore for that one resource that really matters to everyone, water.